Long ago, in the ancient kingdom of Crete, there lived a man whose name was spoken with awe and respect in every corner of the Mediterranean world. His name was Daedalus, a master craftsman, architect, and inventor of unmatched skill. His fame spread far and wide, with many marveling at his creations. From intricate mechanical devices to grandiose architectural structures, Daedalus had a mind that was ahead of his time, capable of conceiving wonders that defied imagination. His most famous creation, however, was the labyrinth, a maze so intricate and complex that even the fiercest and most cunning of minds could not navigate its paths. The labyrinth was designed to imprison the Minotaur, a half-man, half-bull monster that terrorized the people of Crete. It was within this maze that Daedalus's genius would be both his greatest triumph and his most profound sorrow. The labyrinth, though a work of art in its own right, would become a prison of sorts, not for the Minotaur alone, but also for Daedalus and his young son, Icarus. For after creating the labyrinth, Daedalus found himself at odds with the king of Crete, King Minos. Minos, impressed by Daedalus's brilliance but suspicious of his growing power, soon began to fear that Daedalus might betray him. As a result, the king, in his paranoia and desire to control the inventor, imprisoned Daedalus and Icarus in a tower high above the island, where they would be kept under constant surveillance. The tower was surrounded by sheer cliffs, and its walls were made of the hardest stone, making escape seem impossible. The winds howled around them, and the isolation weighed heavily on their spirits, but Daedalus, ever resourceful, refused to give in to despair. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Daedalus and Icarus remained trapped in their prison, their thoughts often turning toward the idea of escape. Daedalus, however, was not a man who would simply surrender to fate. He was a man of innovation, a man whose mind never ceased to seek solutions, no matter how impossible the challenge. As he gazed out from the tower's small windows, Daedalus pondered their situation and the only means of escape, the sky itself. For, despite the walls that surrounded them and the sea that kept them from fleeing by boat, the sky above remained their one path to freedom. With great care and diligence, Daedalus began to work on a plan. The skies, however, held dangers of their own, and the success of his plan would rely not only on his skill but on his ability to navigate the perilous balance between ambition and caution. Using the limited resources at his disposal, Daedalus began his work. He had always been a master of creating things of beauty and utility, and now he would apply his genius to create something that had never been seen before: wings. These wings would be made from feathers and wax, two materials that Daedalus had carefully gathered over time. He spent days, even weeks, meticulously crafting the wings, ensuring that each feather was carefully aligned and each layer of wax was molded to perfection. The wings were designed to mimic the flight of birds, yet Daedalus knew they were fragile. He warned himself and his son that these wings were not infallible. They would be their only hope, but they were also dangerous. Still, Daedalus held on to hope, for the alternative was living the rest of their days in that towering prison. He knew that he must teach Icarus how to use them properly if they were to succeed. The day finally arrived when Daedalus felt the wings were ready. He had finished the last touches, securing the final feathers in place and ensuring the wax was smooth and firm. With a heavy heart, he called for his son. Icarus, though young, had always looked up to his father, admiring his talent and wisdom. The boy entered the room, his face glowing with the innocent excitement of youth. When Daedalus handed him the wings, Icarus's eyes widened in amazement. He had heard of his father's works, but this was something unlike anything he had ever seen before. Daedalus, his expression serious, attached the wings to Icarus's back and began to explain their use. "You must listen carefully, my son," Daedalus said, his voice full of urgency. "The wings will carry us to freedom, but they are fragile. If you fly too high, the sun's heat will melt the wax, and if you fly too low, the moisture of the sea will dampen the feathers. You must find the balance, and you must trust me." With a deep breath, Icarus strapped the wings onto his back. They felt heavy at first, but the boy was filled with a sense of excitement and wonder. For the first time in his life, he felt as though he could truly escape, to soar above the earth and leave behind the confines of the tower that had held him captive for so long. Daedalus was the first to take flight. With the powerful strokes of his wings, he rose into the air, and Icarus, without hesitation, followed close behind. The wind was at their backs, and as they ascended, they could feel the coolness of the air lifting them higher and higher. The world below seemed to shrink with every beat of their wings. For the first time in months, Daedalus felt free, and he could sense that his son shared in the same exhilaration. Together, they flew toward the horizon, the winds urging them onward, away from their prison and into the open sky. The journey began well. The father and son soared through the skies above Crete, their wings cutting through the air with grace and precision. Icarus, filled with the thrill of flight, couldn't help but laugh with joy. The wind kissed his face, and the world below seemed so far away. They flew over the island, passing over the rocky cliffs and the sparkling sea, the sun shining brightly above them. For a while, everything was perfect. Daedalus, keeping a steady pace, called out to Icarus, reminding him to follow his lead.
Stay with me, Icarus, Daedalus called.
The journey will be long, and we must remain steady.
Do not let the winds carry you too far.
But Icarus, caught in the euphoria of flight, couldn't resist the temptation to rise higher. He wanted to touch the sky, to feel the sun upon his wings. His heart urged him to climb higher and higher, until the world below seemed like a distant memory. Daedalus, aware of his son's growing desire to ascend, called out once more, his voice growing more urgent. Icarus, I beg you, do not fly too high. The sun's heat will melt the wax, and your wings will fail. But the words seemed to fall on deaf ears. Icarus, now consumed by the thrill of soaring through the heavens, paid no heed to his father's warnings. The sky seemed endless, and in that moment, nothing else mattered. The more Icarus climbed, the more he felt as though he were defying gravity itself. He could feel the warmth of the sun growing stronger, but the heat only made him feel more alive. He was flying higher than any mortal ever had before, and the exhilaration of it was intoxicating. The air seemed thinner as he ascended, the world far below shrinking into nothingness. Daedalus, watching from below, could see the sun's rays growing ever more intense, but he could not reach his son in time. As Icarus continued to climb, the temperature soared. The wax holding the feathers of his wings began to soften, and the delicate structure of the wings started to falter. Icarus, still lost in his euphoria, did not notice the danger. He flapped his wings harder, pushing himself to go even higher, reaching for the clouds and beyond. But as he rose into the sky, the warmth of the sun grew unbearable. The wax, once firm and solid, began to melt. The feathers began to loosen, fluttering away as the wax dissolved into liquid. It was only then that Icarus felt the first signs of panic. His wings began to weaken, and he tried to flap harder, but it was too late. The wings were falling apart. He felt his body become lighter, and the ground rushed toward him. He tried to call out to his father, but his voice was lost in the wind. Daedalus, witnessing his son's fall, cried out in desperation. "Icarus!" he screamed, but there was no answer. The boy's wings had completely disintegrated, and Icarus, no longer able to stay aloft, was plummeting toward the sea below. Daedalus tried to change course, flying faster than he ever had before, but the distance was too great. His heart sank as he watched his son fall, faster and faster, toward the water. Icarus's body seemed to tumble through the air in slow motion, the once promising flight now reduced to a tragic fall. The waves of the sea, which had once appeared peaceful, now loomed as a dangerous chasm. Daedalus reached the spot where his son had fallen, but when he looked down, there was nothing left. The sea had swallowed Icarus whole, and all that remained was the echo of his name, lost in the wind. Daedalus, in utter grief and despair, hovered in the air above the water, searching for any sign of his son. His wings, once symbols of freedom, now felt heavy and useless. He descended to the waves, his heart filled with sorrow. The sea had claimed Icarus, and there was no way to bring him back. Daedalus knew that his son's death was the result of his own ambition, a tragedy born of the desire to touch the unreachable. He had warned Icarus, pleaded with him, but in the end, the boy had followed his own desires. Daedalus felt a great weight upon his heart, a weight that no wings could lift. The grief was overwhelming, and for the first time, the once proud inventor felt small and helpless. As he flew away from the scene, his wings seemed to lose their strength, and the skies that had once offered him hope now felt empty and cold. Daedalus's heart felt as if it had been torn from his chest. He continued his flight, his wings moving mechanically, as though he were no longer truly in control of them. The sky that had once been a vast expanse of freedom now felt suffocating, a cruel reminder of his failure. Every beat of his wings seemed to bring him farther from the place where Icarus had fallen, Yet no distance seemed enough to distance himself from the unbearable pain of losing his son. He thought back to the days when he had first crafted the wings, when Icarus's face had been filled with innocent wonder. Daedalus had only wanted to give his son the gift of freedom, to allow him to escape the constraints of the tower and experience the boundless beauty of the world. But now, he was left with nothing but the shattered pieces of his hopes, and the bitter knowledge that his son's death had been a consequence of his own ambition. The vastness of the sea below seemed to mirror the emptiness inside him. As Daedalus continued his journey, the winds began to change, and a sense of dread filled the air. The sky, which had once been so full of promise, now seemed dark and foreboding. It was as though the gods themselves were grieving for the loss of Icarus, and the weather had turned to reflect their sorrow. The wind picked up, howling through the sky, as if it were mocking Daedalus's helplessness. The sun, once warm and inviting, now seemed cruel and distant, casting long shadows over the land. Daedalus, his wings growing tired, finally descended to the earth. His thoughts were a whirlwind of grief and regret. He landed on a small island, far from Crete, the place where he had once hoped to find solace. The island, though peaceful in appearance, felt barren to him, like a prison without walls. As he stood there, his mind replayed the events of the flight. His son's laughter, the warnings he had given, and the tragic moment when Icarus had risen too high, chasing the sun. Daedalus knelt by the shore, his hands pressed to the sand, and he wept. His tears, like the waves, seemed to carry the weight of his failure, and the island was silent, save for the sound of his sorrow. The gods, watching from their lofty realms, had long known of the dangers that lay ahead for Icarus. They had seen the potential for greatness in the boy, but they had also foreseen the tragic flaw that would ultimately lead to his downfall. The story of Icarus's flight was not just a tale of ambition, but a lesson, a warning to all who would dare to defy the natural order. The gods, in their eternal wisdom, understood the balance that must be maintained between aspiration and humility. Icarus's arrogance, his belief that he could reach the sun, had sealed his fate. Daedalus, too, was a part of this cosmic story, a man whose brilliance had brought about a great creation, but whose pride and desire to give his son everything had led to his ruin. The gods watched as Daedalus mourned, but they did not intervene. They knew that the pain he felt was the price of knowledge, and that his sorrow would shape the course of his future. After many days of wandering, Daedalus found himself in a distant land. He had no destination in mind, only the need to escape the memories of the tragedy that had occurred. The island where he had landed was nothing more than a small speck in the vastness of the sea, and it offered no comfort. He wandered the land, day after day, in search of something to ease his grief, but nothing could fill the emptiness left by the loss of his son. The people he met along the way were kind, but their faces seemed like a blur to him. His thoughts were always on Icarus, and the memory of his wings, so bright and full of promise, now seemed like a cruel illusion. Daedalus found no solace in the world around him, and his journey seemed endless. It was as though he were trapped in a never-ending cycle of mourning, with no way to escape the darkness that had settled over him. Despite the beauty of the lands he passed through, Daedalus felt a profound sense of isolation. His heart, once filled with hope and ambition, now seemed weighed down by the burden of loss. One day, while traveling through a dense forest, Daedalus stumbled upon a temple dedicated to Apollo, the god of the sun. The temple was ancient, its stone pillars worn and weathered by time, but it still held a sense of reverence. Daedalus, weary from his travels, approached the temple with a mixture of curiosity and sorrow. He entered the temple, the cool air inside offering a brief respite from the heat of the day. The interior was dark, but the faint glow of the sun's rays filtered through cracks in the stone, illuminating the marble statues that lined the walls. Daedalus paused before one of the statues, an image of Apollo himself, radiant and powerful, holding a lyre in his hands. The sight of the god reminded Daedalus of the flight he had taken with Icarus, and the tragic loss that had followed. He stood there for a long time, his thoughts a jumble of grief and longing. As he gazed upon Apollo's image, a sense of quiet understanding filled him. He realized that the gods had not been cruel to him, but had simply shown him the harsh truth of the world. Sometimes, even the greatest of ambitions could lead to ruin. It was here, in the temple of Apollo, that Daedalus came to a profound realization. His grief, though deep, was not the end of his journey. Icarus's death, tragic as it was, had not been in vain. Through his son's fall, Daedalus had learned a lesson about the fragility of life, the delicate balance between ambition and humility. He understood now that greatness was not defined by how high one could fly, but by how one navigated the limits of their existence. Daedalus had sought to give his son the world, to offer him the freedom of flight, but in doing so, he had forgotten the importance of understanding one's place in the world. He had learned that the gods, in their wisdom, had created the laws of nature for a reason, and those who ignored them did so at their own peril. This realization brought Daedalus a sense of peace, a quiet acceptance of the tragedy that had befallen him. From that day forward, Daedalus devoted himself to honoring his son's memory in a way that would not be defined by sorrow or regret. He returned to his craft, focusing his efforts on creating works of beauty that would stand as a testament to the lessons he had learned. He no longer sought to reach beyond the limits of human understanding but instead focused on creating within those limits. Daedalus became known not only for his skill and creativity but for the wisdom that had come from his loss. He shared his story with others, warning them of the dangers of unchecked ambition, and teaching them the value of humility. Though the pain of Icarus's death never fully left him, Daedalus found a way to live with it. In his heart, he carried the memory of his son, and in his work, he carried the lessons of that tragic flight. The gods, in their infinite wisdom, had shown him the way, and Daedalus, though forever scarred, had found his path once more. As the years passed, Daedalus became a sage among the people, not just an inventor. His reputation spread far and wide, not only because of his brilliant creations but also due to the wisdom he shared with those who sought him out. His tale was one of loss and redemption, a story that touched the hearts of many. It was a reminder that even the most gifted of men were not immune to the capricious nature of fate. Daedalus's life became a paradox. He had created wonders, but at the cost of his greatest joy. His works, intricate and beautiful, stood as symbols of his genius, but they were also imprinted with the pain of a father's grief. Despite the sorrow that clung to him like a shadow, Daedalus was no longer a broken man. He had learned to channel his pain into something greater. Each new invention, each new creation, was a tribute to Icarus, a silent prayer to the gods for understanding, and a testament to the power of perseverance in the face of tragedy. One day, while Daedalus was working in his workshop, a young man entered seeking his counsel. The man had heard the legend of Daedalus's flight and the death of Icarus, and he was eager to learn from the master. The young man was filled with ambition, much like Icarus had been, and he sought to create something great. Daedalus, though hesitant at first, saw something in the young man's eyes, a spark of determination that reminded him of his son. Yet, there was also a caution in his heart. He had seen this kind of ambition before, and it had led to disaster. The master inventor could not help but wonder if he had become a cautionary tale, a symbol of what could happen when one reached too far. But he also knew that the young man had the potential to create something extraordinary. He decided to take the young man under his wing, offering him the wisdom that he had gained through his own painful journey. Ambition is not the enemy, Daedalus told him, but it must be tempered with understanding. You must know your limits if you are to achieve greatness. Under Daedalus's guidance, the young man began to create his own works of art and invention. The old inventor, who had once been consumed by grief, now found a renewed sense of purpose in teaching. It was as though the tragedy of his past had finally found its meaning. Through his mentoring, Daedalus imparted not only his technical knowledge but also the deeper lessons he had learned from his own mistakes. The young man was quick to grasp these lessons, and his creations flourished under Daedalus's watchful eye. Yet, despite the progress they made together, Daedalus could not help but feel a pang of sorrow whenever he looked at the young man. He saw in him the same bright potential that he had once seen in Icarus. But this time, Daedalus was determined to guide the young man away from the same fate. As they worked side by side, Daedalus often found himself lost in thought, remembering the dreams he had shared with Icarus, the hopes he had placed in his son, and the tragic end that had befallen him. The young man, eager to prove his worth, began to push himself further, attempting more complex inventions and ideas. He would often work late into the night, just as Daedalus had once done. But the older inventor, now wiser and more cautious, saw the same dangerous fire in the young man that had once burned in Icarus. You must remember the lesson, Daedalus warned. You cannot fly too close to the sun. The young man, filled with the vigor of youth, brushed off the warning, believing that he could transcend the limitations that others had imposed on him. But Daedalus, with the weight of experience upon him, knew that the gods had a way of humbling even the most determined souls. One night, as the young man prepared to test one of his most ambitious creations, Daedalus pulled him aside. The path of creation is long and fraught with challenges, he said. his voice firm yet filled with concern. "There is no shame in knowing your limits. In fact, it is the wisest course." Despite Daedalus's warnings, the young man pressed on, undeterred by the shadow of doubt that hung over him. He crafted a set of wings similar to those Daedalus had once made, but this time they were built with a different purpose: to allow him to soar even higher, to break free of the boundaries that had been set by nature. Daedalus watched in silence, torn between admiration for the young man's determination and fear for his safety. He knew that no matter how skilled the young man was, there were forces in the world beyond his control. The gods had set the rules of nature for a reason, and those who defied them often paid a heavy price. The young man, however, remained resolute in his belief that he could overcome these constraints. He took to the skies, his wings unfurling against the backdrop of the setting sun. Daedalus, standing at the edge of the workshop, watched as the young man climbed higher and higher, his heart heavy with the knowledge of what was about to happen. The young man, like Icarus before him, soared into the sky with a sense of exhilaration and freedom. But as he ascended, the heat of the sun began to intensify, and the wings that had once been so carefully crafted began to tremble under the pressure. Daedalus, standing on the ground, felt his heart race as he watched the young man push further into the heavens. He called out, but his voice was lost in the wind. The young man, intoxicated by the thrill of flight, paid no heed to the warning signs. The sun's heat grew unbearable, and the wings, unable to withstand the strain, began to falter. Daedalus's worst fear was realized as he saw the young man's wings melt, and he plummeted to the earth, just as Icarus had done before him. The master inventor sank to his knees, the weight of his failure pressing down on him once again. He had not been able to save the young man, just as he had not been able to save his own son. The cycle of tragedy seemed endless, and Daedalus felt the crushing weight of guilt and sorrow once more. Daedalus stood in stunned silence, his heart heavy with the same pain that had crushed him when he lost Icarus. The young man, once full of hope and ambition, now lay lifeless on the ground, his wings torn apart by the very sun he had sought to challenge. The grief that swept over Daedalus was unbearable, and yet it felt strangely familiar. He had failed again, and this time it felt as though he had relived his own tragedy. His mind raced, trying to comprehend the events that had unfolded before him. He thought back to the lessons he had tried to impart, the warnings he had given, but it seemed that neither words nor wisdom could prevent the inevitable. The sky above, once a symbol of freedom, now seemed oppressive, a constant reminder of the cost of ambition. Daedalus fell to his knees beside the young man's body, his tears mixing with the dust of the earth. This time, there were no gods to witness the tragedy, no divine intervention to offer a sense of justice. There was only silence, and the weight of loss. As Daedalus wept for the young man, he was reminded of the countless hours he had spent in his workshop, crafting his inventions, and the lessons he had learned from his own son's death. He had come to believe that perhaps the gods had a hand in the tragic fate that had befallen them both. But now, as he knelt beside the broken body of the young man, he wondered if there was truly a greater purpose behind these losses. Was this just the cruel play of fate, or was it a reminder that the pursuit of greatness came at a cost? Daedalus could not escape the feeling that he had been given a lesson to learn, but he had failed to understand it. Perhaps he had been too focused on his creations, too consumed by his own genius to see the bigger picture. The gods, in their eternal wisdom, had shown him time and time again that human ambition had its limits. But did that mean that all great achievements were doomed to end in tragedy? Or was it simply that Daedalus himself had not yet come to terms with the nature of his own ambition? In the days that followed, Daedalus found himself once again consumed by sorrow, but this time, he could not escape the feeling of being trapped in a cycle of despair. The young man's death had shaken him to his core, and he could not help but question his own purpose. Was he merely a creator of tragedy, doomed to watch as those around him reached too high and fell? He returned to his workshop, the place where he had once found solace in his craft, but now it seemed like a prison. The tools, the designs, and the blueprints that had once filled him with pride now felt like reminders of his failures. Daedalus's hands, once steady and sure, trembled as he picked up his tools. It seemed that every creation he made, every invention he crafted, was marked by the same fatal flaw, an ambition that pushed too far, a desire that reached beyond what was possible. He wondered if he had been cursed, if his genius was destined to bring pain and suffering rather than joy and progress. One evening, as Daedalus sat alone in his workshop, deep in thought, a figure appeared at the door. It was a woman, draped in a simple but elegant robe, with an aura of quiet strength. She stepped into the workshop without a word, and Daedalus, startled by her sudden appearance, looked up. Her eyes were kind but filled with an ancient wisdom, and for a moment, Daedalus felt as though he were in the presence of a being far greater than himself. She introduced herself as Athena, the goddess of wisdom, and Daedalus, still in a daze, bowed his head in respect. Athena had come not to offer pity, but to offer something more valuable: insight. She spoke to him of the balance between creation and destruction, of the role of the gods in shaping the fates of mortals, and of the lessons that could be gleaned from tragedy. "You have given much to the world, Daedalus," Athena said softly, "but you must learn that wisdom lies not in the heights you reach, but in the lessons you take from the fall." Athena's words resonated deeply with Daedalus. For the first time in years, he felt as though he had been given a glimpse of clarity. He had spent so much of his life trying to create, to push the boundaries of what was possible, that he had forgotten the true meaning of wisdom. It was not about defying the laws of nature or surpassing the gods. It was about understanding the limits of one's own power and learning to live within those boundaries. Daedalus had spent his life chasing greatness, but in doing so, he had ignored the most important lesson of all: that greatness was not something to be attained, but something to be understood. Athena spoke of the fragility of life, and how every creation, no matter how brilliant, carried with it the potential for ruin. But she also reminded him that there was no shame in learning from those falls, no shame in finding peace after tragedy. "You have the ability to create," Athena said, "but you must learn to create with humility, to understand that even in the face of loss, there is wisdom to be found." In the days that followed, Daedalus began to change. He no longer sought to defy the gods or surpass the natural world, but instead, he focused on creating works that honored the balance between life and death, light and darkness. He became a master of understanding the limits of his craft, and in doing so, he found a new sense of peace. The workshop, once a place of torment and grief, became a sanctuary of creation, where Daedalus worked not to achieve greatness, but to learn from the lessons of his past. His inventions, though still brilliant, were no longer driven by ambition. Instead, they were driven by a quiet understanding of the world's fragility. Daedalus no longer sought to fly to the sun, but to walk the earth with humility, knowing that even the greatest of men must one day fall. The gods had shown him the way, and in that knowledge, he found his true path. As Daedalus embraced this new philosophy, a profound transformation took place within him. He no longer saw himself as a master of the skies or an invincible creator. Instead, he became a humble servant to the craft of invention, working in harmony with nature rather than attempting to control it. His creations, though still magnificent, were filled with an understated beauty, reflecting the balance between human ingenuity and the forces beyond one's understanding. The wings of birds, the patterns of the stars, the delicate lines of a spider's web, these became his new sources of inspiration. He no longer sought to transcend the limitations of the world around him. Rather, he sought to honor them. His workshop, once filled with grand designs meant to surpass the heavens, now held simpler, yet more profound creations that sought to celebrate the wonder of existence itself. These works were quieter, more contemplative, but they spoke with a depth that resonated with those who saw them. And though Daedalus never forgot the tragedy of Icarus and the young man who followed him, he had learned to accept that life was not only about the heights one reached but about the wisdom gained through each fall. Years passed, and Daedalus grew older. His hair turned silver, and his hands became frail, though still capable of shaping wood, metal, and stone with a steady precision. He no longer desired fame or recognition. The people who visited his workshop came not to seek grand inventions, but to learn the quiet wisdom that had come from his years of loss and reflection. They learned that greatness was not about conquering the heavens or defying the gods, but about finding one's place within the world and understanding the rhythms of life. Many sought him out, not to create marvels, but to learn how to live with the knowledge that all things, whether they be dreams, ambitions, or creations, were fleeting. Daedalus's reputation shifted from that of a mere inventor to that of a sage, a teacher who shared the lessons of his life. And though his heart still carried the weight of his past, it was lighter now, for he had come to understand that the most important thing was not to avoid failure, but to learn from it. One day, a visitor arrived at Daedalus's workshop who was different from the others. This man, though young, carried with him the weight of the world, and his eyes were filled with a deep sorrow that Daedalus recognized all too well. He was a prince, the son of a great king, and he had come to seek the guidance of the master inventor. He spoke of his own ambition, of the desire to create something that would immortalize his name and surpass all others. "I seek to create a marvel," the prince said. "Something that will be remembered for all time. I want to build something that will make me immortal." Daedalus listened quietly, and when the prince finished speaking, he did not immediately respond. Instead, he studied the young man with a gaze that seemed to pierce to the heart of his desires. The prince's words echoed the very same aspirations Daedalus himself had once harbored. He, too, had sought to leave a legacy that would endure, to create something that would defy time and fate. But now, Daedalus knew better. He had seen the price of such ambition, and he understood the dangers that lay in seeking immortality through works that defied nature. "Immortality is not granted through grand works, young prince," Daedalus said at last. "It is granted through the lives we touch and the wisdom we leave behind." The prince, though initially taken aback by Daedalus's response, found himself intrigued. He had come seeking a way to ensure that his name would live on forever, but Daedalus spoke of something far deeper than mere fame. The master inventor spoke of the importance of humility, of creating not for glory, but for the betterment of the world around him. He told the prince of his own journey, of the tragic loss of his son Icarus, and the lessons he had learned from that pain. "I, too, once sought immortality," Daedalus confessed. "But I learned that it is not through creating something that defies nature or fate that we become immortal. It is through the love and wisdom we share with others, and through the humility with which we approach the world." The prince listened intently, and as the conversation continued, he began to see the truth in Daedalus's words. He realized that his desire for eternal glory had been driven by fear of being forgotten, of being insignificant in the grand tapestry of time. But Daedalus, in his quiet wisdom, showed him that true greatness was not about transcending time, but about embracing the fleeting nature of life and finding meaning in the present moment. Over the following weeks, the prince continued to visit Daedalus, and their conversations grew deeper. The master inventor, though old and weary, found renewed purpose in sharing his wisdom with the young prince. He no longer spoke only of the mechanics of invention, but of the deeper truths that underpinned all creation. The prince, once consumed by his own ambition, began to see the world differently. He started to understand that his legacy would not be built through grand monuments or impossible feats of engineering, but through the choices he made and the lives he touched. As the prince left Daedalus's workshop one final time, he felt a sense of peace he had never known before. The weight of his ambition had lifted, and in its place, he carried with him a new understanding of what it meant to truly create. He thanked Daedalus for his guidance and promised a return, but Daedalus knew that the prince had already been transformed. The lessons he had shared would carry on, not just through words, but through the prince's actions and the way he lived his life. In the years that followed, Daedalus continued his quiet work, finding joy in the simple acts of creation. He no longer sought to build monuments to his own genius, but instead, he created works that spoke to the beauty and fragility of life. His legacy was not one of grand inventions, but of the wisdom he had shared with others. He had learned, at last, that the most enduring creations were those that came from a place of humility and understanding, not from the desire to transcend mortality. And when the time came for Daedalus to leave this world, he did so with a peaceful heart, knowing that his true immortality lay not in the works he had built, but in the lives he had touched, and the wisdom he had passed on. His story, like those of the gods and heroes of old, became a legend, but it was a legend born not from ambition, but from the lessons of a man who had learned to embrace the fleeting nature of life and the wisdom of the fall.